At my granddaughter's wedding, I noticed my son avoiding my eyes every time I mentioned the house. I didn't think much of it at first. Then, on my way to the supermarket 2 days later, I forgot my wallet and had to return home. What I heard through my own bedroom door changed everything I thought I knew about my family. I just stood there quietly with a bag of groceries in my hands. What I did after that left them speechless. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and tell me where you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I used to believe that grief brought families closer together. That was what my husband Daniel always said whenever someone in town lost a loved one. Hard times reveal character. He would tell me while sitting on our back porch with a cup of black coffee warming his hands. You find out who truly loves you when life stops being convenient. At 67 years old, I thought I already understood that lesson. I was wrong. The morning everything began looked painfully ordinary. The October air in Cedar Grove carried that familiar chill that settles into old bones faster than it used to. I woke before sunrise, like I always did, and padded slowly into the kitchen wearing my pale blue robe. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock above the stove. For 42 years, mornings in this house had belonged to Daniel and me. Even now, 2 years after cancer took him, I still found myself reaching for a second coffee mug before remembering there was no one sitting across from me anymore. I stood there for a moment holding the extra mug. Then I quietly placed it back into the cabinet. Little habits survive long after people are gone. I opened the curtains above the sink and watched the sky slowly brighten over the maple trees lining our street. The leaves had already turned shades of copper and red. Daniel used to love this time of year. Every October, he insisted on decorating the front porch with pumpkins even when the grandchildren were too old to care. Traditions matter, he'd say. I used to smile at that. Now the pumpkins sat untouched in a box inside the garage, because nobody visited often enough anymore to notice them. My son Ethan and his wife, Claire, had moved into the house 8 months earlier. At the time, it had sounded reasonable. You shouldn't be living alone at your age, Mom, Ethan told me after my second fall that winter. Besides, Claire and I can help with the bills and maintenance. I had believed him because I wanted to believe him. After Daniel died, the silence inside this house became unbearable some nights. There were evenings when I would sit in the living room pretending to watch television just to avoid hearing how empty everything sounded. So when Ethan suggested they move in temporarily, I welcomed it. Family, noise, life in the house again. At first, it almost felt normal. Claire brought scented candles into the kitchen and reorganized the pantry without asking. Ethan fixed the loose railing on the front porch Daniel had never gotten around to repairing before his treatments began. They filled the rooms with conversation and movement and expensive gadgets that connected to apps I barely understood. I told myself the discomfort I occasionally felt was simply part of adjusting. But over time, something shifted. Quietly, slowly, the way poison spreads through water before anyone notices the taste. Claire stopped asking before changing things around the house. Furniture disappeared into storage. Family photos vanished from shelves and were replaced with abstract decorations that looked cold and expensive. One afternoon, I came home from church and found Daniel's recliner missing from the den. "Oh, we donated it," Claire said casually while scrolling through her phone. It smelled old. I remember staring at her. That chair had been where my husband spent his final weeks watching baseball games with a blanket over his legs. I opened my mouth to protest, then closed it again. Grief teaches you how exhausting conflict can become. So instead, I nodded and quietly made myself tea. That became my role inside my own house. Quiet, careful, out of the way. The wedding should have warned me. My granddaughter Sophie got married at the Westlake Country Club the previous Saturday. It was one of those elegant ceremonies people spend years planning. White roses everywhere, crystal chandeliers, a string quartet playing soft music while guests sipped champagne beside the lake. I spent almost 2 hours getting ready that afternoon. At my age, appearances stop being about vanity and start becoming about dignity. I curled my silver hair carefully and wore the emerald necklace Daniel gave me on our 30th anniversary. The clasp still stuck slightly on one side because he bought it from a tiny jewelry shop during a road trip through Vermont, and neither of us ever bothered fixing it. "You look beautiful," he had whispered when he first fastened it around my neck. I could still hear his voice sometimes if the house was quiet enough. At the reception, I noticed Ethan acting strangely every time someone mentioned the house. Small things at first. A forced smile. A quick glance toward Claire. A subject change too fast to feel natural. When Daniel's old friend Walter asked whether I still planned on hosting Christmas Eve dinner this year, Ethan answered before I could. "We'll probably do something smaller," he said quickly. Claire squeezed his arm beneath the table. I noticed because old women notice everything eventually. Still, I ignored the feeling in my stomach. People tell themselves comforting lies when the truth feels too lonely. 2 mornings later, I decided to drive to Harrington's Market for groceries. The refrigerator was nearly empty except for yogurt, eggs, and leftover chicken soup I'd made the previous evening. Claire and Ethan rarely cooked anymore. Most nights, they ordered expensive takeout meals that arrived in paper bags with logos I couldn't pronounce. I missed real dinners. Daniel believed families should eat together at the same table every night possible. Even when Ethan was a difficult teenager, Daniel insisted we sit together without television or phones. "Conversation matters," he'd say. Now most meals happen behind separate doors. I grabbed my purse, made a short shopping list, and drove across town beneath cloudy skies threatening rain. The parking lot at Harrington's was crowded. I had just climbed out of my Buick when I realized my wallet wasn't. Inside my purse, I checked twice, then a third time. Nothing. I remember sighing quietly and leaning against the car for a moment. Getting old means returning for forgotten things more often than you like admitting. So I drove back home. That small mistake changed my life. When I pulled into the driveway, Ethan's car was gone. Claire's white Lexus remained parked beside the garage. I assumed she was upstairs working remotely like usual. I carried my empty purse inside through the side entrance near the laundry room. The house smelled faintly of Claire's vanilla candles and fresh coffee. Then I heard laughter upstairs. A man's laughter. Low, comfortable, familiar in the worst possible way. I froze. For a second, I actually wondered if Ethan had come home unexpectedly. But it wasn't his voice. I knew my son's voice the same way mothers know the sound of their babies crying in crowded rooms. This voice belonged to someone older. I moved quietly toward the staircase. The laughter came again, followed by Claire speaking softly. "She'll sign eventually," she said. Every muscle in my body tightened. I climbed the stairs slowly, one hand gripping the railing hard enough to hurt my knuckles. The bedroom door stood slightly open. Just enough. I could see Claire sitting on my bed wearing a silk robe, leaning close beside a man in a charcoal suit. Documents covered the comforter. Folders. Property papers. A yellow legal pad. The man pointed toward one document while speaking quietly. "If she transfers the title before January, you'll avoid most of the tax complications." Claire smiled. Not nervous. Not guilty. Relaxed. Confident. "She trusts Ethan completely," she replied. "And Ethan trusts me." I felt something cold move through my chest. Not heartbreak. Not even anger at first. Recognition. Like finally seeing the shape of something dark that had been standing in the corner for months. The man flipped another page. "An assisted living?" Claire shrugged casually. "We found a smaller place about 40 minutes away. Honestly, she'll complain for a while, but she'll adjust." I stopped breathing. They were talking about me. About my home. My future. Like I was already halfway. Gone. The grocery list slipped from my fingers onto the hardwood floor. Claire's head snapped toward the doorway. For one long second, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Her face lost all color. The man immediately closed the folders. I looked at the documents on my bed, then at my daughter-in-law, then at the stranger sitting beside her. I didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't ask questions. At 67 years old, I had already learned something important about betrayal. The loudest person in the room is rarely the strongest. So I simply bent down, picked up my grocery list, and looked directly at Claire. "Excuse me," I said calmly. "I forgot my wallet." Then I turned around and walked downstairs without another word. Behind me, I heard Claire calling my name. I kept walking. By the time I reached my car, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely fit the key into the ignition. But one thought kept repeating itself in my mind over and over during the entire drive back to the supermarket. Daniel knew something before he died. And suddenly, I needed to find out exactly what it was. I drove around the Harrington's Market parking lot 3 times before finally pulling into a space near the shopping carts. Rain had started falling lightly against the windshield. For several minutes, I just sat there with both hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at nothing. People moved around outside carrying grocery bags, hurrying through the cold October drizzle. A young mother struggled to keep her toddler from splashing in a puddle near the cart return. An older man loaded pumpkins into the back of his truck while his wife held an umbrella over both of them. Ordinary life. Completely normal. And somehow that made everything hurt worse. Because less than 20 minutes earlier, I had been standing outside my own bedroom listening to strangers discuss where they planned to send me once they convinced me to sign away my home. I closed my eyes. Claire's voice replayed inside my head over and over. She'll adjust, as if I were an inconvenience. As if 42 years inside that house meant nothing. As if my life could simply be boxed up and relocated somewhere quiet and cheap. Until I disappeared completely. My throat tightened suddenly. Not from anger. From humiliation. There's a particular kind of pain that comes with realizing people have already started erasing you while you're still alive. I looked down at my wedding ring. Daniel's hands had slipped that ring onto my finger in the spring of 1981 inside a tiny church outside Milwaukee. We had almost no money back then. His suit jacket didn't fit correctly, and my mother spent the entire ceremony whispering complaints about the flowers being too small. But Daniel looked at me like I was the only person in the world. I remembered that clearly. Even now, especially now, a horn sounded somewhere nearby, startling me back into the present. I wiped beneath my eyes quickly before anyone could see. Then I finally stepped out of the car and walked into the supermarket. I don't remember half of what I bought that afternoon. Soup cans, bread, coffee, eggs, the kind of things people buy automatically when their minds are somewhere else. At one point, I stood staring at the cereal aisle for almost 2 full minutes because I couldn't remember whether Ethan still liked the Honey Oat brand he used to eat as a teenager. Then I caught myself. Why was I still thinking like that? Why was I still worrying about feeding people who were quietly planning my removal from the only home I had left? I placed the cereal box back on the shelf. That tiny action felt strangely important. Small, but important. By the time I returned home, Claire's Lexus was gone. The house sat silent beneath gray skies. I carried the grocery bags inside slowly, listening carefully for movement even though I already knew nobody was there. The silence felt different now. Not peaceful, watchful. I set the groceries on the kitchen counter and looked around the room. Everything suddenly seemed unfamiliar. The expensive white candles Claire kept near the sink. The modern fruit bowl she bought after throwing away Daniel's old wooden one because it looked dated. Even the new coffee machine Ethan installed last Christmas suddenly felt like evidence that the house no longer belonged to me the way it once had. I opened the refrigerator and quietly began putting groceries away. Milk on the second shelf, eggs in the side compartment, tomatoes inside the crisper drawer. Simple tasks, steady tasks, the kind that keep your hands busy while your mind falls apart. Then I noticed something sitting near the back of the refrigerator. A small plastic container from Bellamy's Steakhouse downtown. Daniel and I used to celebrate anniversaries there every year. The receipt was still attached to the bag. Dinner for two nights earlier. The same evening Claire told me she was working late. I stared at the receipt longer than I should have. Finally, I folded it quietly and slipped it into my cardigan pocket. Not because I planned to confront her. Not yet. But because something inside me had changed upstairs when I heard them talking. A curtain had lifted. And once you see people clearly, you start noticing everything. I finished unpacking groceries and carried my coffee into the living room. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The grandfather clock near the staircase ticked steadily through the silence. Daniel bought that clock 23 years ago from an antique store in Ohio during one of our road trips. Ethan hated it as a child because the chimes woke him up at night. Now it was one of the few things Claire hadn't tried replacing, probably because it looked expensive. I sat down slowly in the corner armchair and let the memories come. Not the happy ones at first, the strange ones. The moments I ignored because I didn't want conflict. 3 months earlier, I came downstairs one night around midnight for water and found Claire standing inside Daniel's old office going through filing cabinets. She smiled too quickly when she saw me. Just looking for tax paperwork, she said. At the time, I apologized for startling her. Apologized. In my own house. Another memory surfaced. 2 weeks ago, Ethan asked casual questions during dinner about whether I had updated my will recently. Claire stayed unusually quiet through that entire conversation. Watching, listening. I remembered that now. And suddenly, every uncomfortable moment from the past year began fitting together like pieces of broken glass. The Missing paperwork. The whispers stopping when I entered rooms. The sudden conversations about retirement communities for peace of mind. Even Sophie's wedding. Claire spent half the reception speaking privately with a man I didn't recognize. A man in a charcoal suit. The same man sitting on my bed earlier that afternoon. I felt cold all over. Not weak. Not confused anymore. Just cold. By 7 o'clock, headlights swept across the front windows. Ethan and Claire were home. I remained seated in the living room, hands folded calmly in my lap. The front door opened. Their voices drifted inside. Claire was laughing too loudly. Ethan sounded tired. Then they saw me sitting there. For one brief second, Claire froze. Only 1 second, but it was enough. "Hey, Mom," Ethan said carefully while hanging his coat near the door. "You okay?" I looked at him, really looked at him. The little boy who used to climb into our bed during thunderstorms. The teenager who cried after totaling Daniel's truck at 17. The grown man, now standing inside my living room while his wife planned how to remove me from my own home. And somehow that hurt more than Claire ever could. "I'm fine," I said softly. Claire set her purse down slowly. "You came home earlier today?" she asked. There it was. Careful. Measured. Fishing for information. I took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "Yes," I said. "I forgot my wallet." Neither of them spoke. The grandfather clock chimed once into the silence. Then Claire smiled. That polished, practiced smile she used whenever she wanted to smooth over tension. "Well," she said lightly. "Good thing you remembered before getting to the register." I held her gaze for several long seconds. Then I smiled back. "Yes," I said quietly. "Good thing." That night, I barely slept. Every sound inside the house seemed louder than usual. The pipes creaking behind the walls. The hum of the dishwasher downstairs. Footsteps crossing the hallway outside my bedroom sometime after midnight. I lay awake staring at the ceiling while shadows from passing headlights moved slowly across the room. For years after Daniel died, insomnia had become familiar to me. Grief doesn't disappear when people expect it to. It changes shape. Some nights it sits quietly beside you. Other nights it presses against your chest until breathing feels heavy. But this wasn't grief keeping me awake anymore. It was realization. There's something deeply unsettling about understanding that people have been discussing your future behind closed doors while smiling politely to your face every morning. Around 2 in the morning, I heard muffled voices downstairs. Claire and Ethan, arguing quietly. I couldn't make out every word, only pieces drifting upward through the vents. Should have told me. She saw something? You said she wouldn't notice, then silence. I turned my head toward Daniel's photograph sitting on the bedside table. It was my favorite picture of him, taken during a fishing trip in northern Wisconsin about 10 years earlier. He stood beside the lake wearing a faded brewer's cap and smiling directly at the camera like he had nowhere else in the world to be. Daniel always trusted people slower than I did, especially Claire. At first, I thought it was because they were too similar. Both organized, both stubborn in quiet ways. But near the end of his illness, I remember him saying something one evening while Claire was helping Ethan clean the kitchen after dinner. "She watches everything," he murmured softly after they left the room. I laughed at the time. "Of course she does," I told him. "She's detail-oriented." But Daniel just shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "I mean she watches people. There's a difference." Back then, I dismissed it as medication making him suspicious. Now I wondered how much he noticed that I never did. The next morning, I woke before sunrise again. Old habits survive almost everything. I dressed quietly and walked downstairs while the house remained dark. Rain still fell outside, soft against the windows. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee grounds and Claire's vanilla candles. For a long moment, I simply stood there looking around. This had once been my favorite room in the house. Daniel built the breakfast nook beside the windows himself during the summer Ethan turned 12. Every Sunday morning we ate pancakes. They're while listening to old jazz records. Ethan used to complain whenever Daniel played Frank Sinatra too early because he preferred cartoons. I could almost hear those mornings if I closed my eyes long enough. But memory can become dangerous when you live too long inside it. So instead, I made coffee and began paying attention. Really paying attention. Claire's purse sat near the island counter, partially open. Inside, I noticed a folded brochure sticking out from the top. Golden Meadows Senior Living. My stomach tightened immediately. I recognized the building from somewhere near Brookfield. Small apartments. Assisted care. Shuttle transportation. Weekly bingo nights and craft rooms designed to look cheerful enough that families wouldn't feel guilty leaving people there. I stared at the brochure for several seconds, then carefully slid it back exactly where I found it. A few minutes later, Ethan walked into the kitchen still wearing sweatpants and looking exhausted. "Morning, Mom," he said quietly. I handed him a coffee mug automatically. For a second, it almost felt normal again. He leaned against the counter rubbing his eyes while rain tapped softly outside. Then I noticed something else. Stress. Real stress. Not guilt exactly. Pressure. The kind Daniel used to carry during difficult years at the hardware distribution company before he finally sold his shares. "Everything okay at work?" I asked carefully. Ethan hesitated too long. "Yeah," he answered finally. "Just busy." Busy. People hide entire disasters behind that word. I nodded slowly and stirred cream into my coffee. "When's the last time you saw Walter Green?" I asked casually. His head lifted immediately. Too quickly. Walter had been Daniel's attorney and closest friend for nearly 30 years. "I don't know," Ethan said. "Maybe the funeral?" Another lie. I knew because Walter attended Sophie's wedding last weekend. I saw him speaking privately with Ethan near the bar during cocktail hour. At the time, Ethan looked irritated afterward. Now I wondered why. Claire entered the kitchen a few minutes later wearing a cream-colored sweater and that same polished smile she used like armor. "Morning," she said brightly. Nobody answered immediately. The silence lasted barely 2 seconds, but it was enough to make all three of us aware of it. Claire opened the refrigerator and frowned slightly. "You bought regular creamer?" she asked. "You know Ethan drinks oat milk now." I looked at my son. He avoided my eyes. "I forgot," I said quietly. Claire sighed softly like I had failed some invisible test. "It's okay," she replied. "I'll grab some later." Little comments. Tiny humiliations. That's how people slowly train you to feel unnecessary inside your own life. Daniel never allowed that kind of disrespect. Not from Ethan. Not from anyone. Once, when Ethan was 16, he rolled his eyes at me during dinner after I reminded him to call his grandmother back. Daniel put down his fork immediately. "You will not look at your mother that way," he said calmly. The entire table went silent. Ethan apologized before dessert. That was the kind of man my husband was. Steady, protective, present. And suddenly I realized something that made my chest ache all over again. The real reason Claire waited until after Daniel died to begin this. Because she knew he would have stopped it immediately. Around 10 that morning, Claire left for what she called a client meeting. The moment her Lexus disappeared down the street, I walked upstairs toward the master bedroom. My bedroom once. Their bedroom now. Even after yesterday, stepping inside still felt wrong. The bed was perfectly made. Claire's perfume lingered faintly in the air. I moved slowly toward the closet where I remembered seeing the folders scattered across the bed the previous afternoon. Nothing. No paperwork. No legal pads. No folders. But as I turned to leave, something caught my attention near the nightstand trash bin. A crumpled yellow sticky note. I bent down and unfolded it carefully. Written across the paper was an address in downtown Milwaukee. Bennett and Rowe Property Consultants. Underneath it, another sentence. Needs signature before November 1st. I stared at the words for a long moment. Then I folded the note carefully and slipped it into my pocket beside the steakhouse receipt. For the first time since Daniel died, I felt something besides sadness begin settling inside me. Clarity. And deep down, I already knew exactly who I needed to call next. I waited until after lunch to call Walter Green. Not because I was afraid, because I needed time to think clearly. There's a dangerous moment after betrayal when emotions try to convince you to act too quickly. Daniel used to say that anger makes people sloppy. The calm person usually wins, he'd tell Ethan whenever they played chess together at the kitchen table. So I stayed calm, at least on the outside. The rain finally stopped sometime around noon, leaving the neighborhood wrapped in that cold gray stillness that comes after autumn storms. Wet leaves clung to the sidewalk beneath the maple trees, and somewhere down the block a lawn mower droned weakly against the damp grass. Inside the house, everything felt unusually quiet. Claire hadn't returned yet. Ethan was upstairs in his office taking conference calls behind closed doors. I could hear the low rhythm of his voice through the ceiling while I sat at the kitchen table, holding my coffee cup between both hands. The sticky note remained folded carefully inside my cardigan pocket. Bennett and Rowe Property Consultants. Needs signature before November 1st. Every time I thought about those words, I felt the same cold heaviness settle deeper into my chest. Not panic anymore. Something sharper than that. Awareness. I finally picked up my phone and dialed Walter's number from memory. He answered on the third ring. "Margaret?" he said immediately, sounding surprised. "Everything all right?" For a second, hearing the familiar warmth in his voice nearly broke me. Walter had been part of our lives for so long that I sometimes forgot he was an actual family. He and Daniel met during college and stayed friends through marriages, children, business failures, recoveries, and eventually illness. Walter helped us write our wills. He helped Daniel structure the trust after selling his company's shares. And he sat beside me at the hospital cafeteria the night doctors quietly admitted the treatments were no longer working. "I need to see you," I said softly. A pause followed. Not long, but long enough. "When?" he asked carefully. "Today." Another pause. Then his voice lowered slightly. "Does this have something to do with Ethan?" I stared down into my untouched coffee. "Yes," I answered. Walter sighed quietly. Not surprised. That hurt more than I expected. We agreed to meet at his office downtown at 3 o'clock. After hanging up, I remained seated at the kitchen table for several minutes, staring at the steam rising from my coffee. Walter knew something, or at least suspected something. And suddenly I remembered another strange moment from Sophie's wedding. Near the end of the reception, I saw Walter speaking privately with Daniel's former business partner near the dance floor. Both men glanced toward Ethan, while Claire laughed loudly beside the champagne tower. At the time, I assumed they were discussing old memories. Now I wasn't so sure. At 2:30, I grabbed my coat and purse from the hallway closet. Ethan came downstairs just as I reached the front door. "You heading somewhere?" he asked casually. I turned toward him slowly. Even exhausted, my son still looked so much like Daniel sometimes that it physically hurt to see him. Same dark hair beginning to gray near the temples. Same broad shoulders. Same tired eyes. But Daniel's eyes never avoided mine the way Ethan's did now. "I'm meeting a friend," I replied calmly. Ethan nodded too quickly. "Okay," he said. "Claire mentioned maybe ordering Thai food tonight if you want anything." Claire mentioned, as if they'd already discussed the evening without me. "I won't be hungry," I answered. His expression shifted slightly then. Concern maybe. Or guilt. It's hard to tell the difference once trust disappears. "Mom," he started carefully. "About yesterday, I waited." But he stopped. Whatever explanation he planned to offer died somewhere behind his teeth. Finally, he just shook his head lightly. "Never mind," he muttered. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I opened the front door and left. Walter's office occupied the second floor of an old brick building overlooking the Milwaukee River. Daniel always loved that building because it still had creaky wooden floors and brass elevator doors that looked untouched since the 1940s. Some places survive modernization simply because nobody remembers how to replace them. Walter greeted me personally when I arrived. The moment he saw my face, his expression changed. Concern first, then something heavier. He closed his office door quietly behind me. "What happened?" he asked. I sat down slowly across from his desk and removed the folded sticky note from my pocket. Walter read it once, then again. His jaw tightened immediately. "Where did you get this?" "In my bedroom." I watched his face carefully while he stared at the paper. Not confusion, recognition. That terrified me more than anything else so far. "Walter," I said quietly, "what's going on?" He leaned back heavily in his chair and removed his glasses. For several seconds, he simply rubbed one hand across his forehead like a man deciding how much truth another person can survive hearing at once. Finally, he looked directly at me. 3 months ago, he said slowly, Ethan asked me questions about transferring property ownership. The room suddenly felt colder. I gripped the arms of the chair without realizing it. "What kind of questions?" Walter hesitated. "The kind people ask when they're trying to move assets quickly." I stared at him. "He said you were considering downsizing voluntarily." Walter continued carefully. "An assisted living community closer to medical care." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because hearing the lie spoken aloud made it sound even uglier somehow. "I never said that." "I know." Silence filled the office. Outside the windows, traffic moved slowly through wet downtown streets, while somewhere nearby a siren echoed briefly against the buildings. Walter folded his hands together on the desk. "There's more," he said quietly. Something inside me tightened immediately. "What more?" Walter opened a drawer and pulled out a thin manila folder. Then he slid it carefully across the desk toward me. Inside sat photocopies of documents, legal documents, property transfer drafts, trust modification requests, and near the bottom of the stack, my signature, or something trying very hard to look like it. I stopped breathing for a moment. The signature wasn't perfect, but close enough that many people probably wouldn't notice the difference. Except I did, because those shaky little curves weren't mine. Someone had practiced my handwriting, over and over. Walter watched my face carefully. I refused to process anything, he said firmly. That's when Ethan stopped returning my calls. I looked down again at the forged signature. Then another detail caught my eye. Claire's name, not Ethan's. Claire Whitmore listed beside property restructuring paperwork connected directly to Daniel's trust. Suddenly, every strange moment from the past year clicked into place all at once. The late-night whispers, the missing files, the pressure to simplify my future. They weren't trying to help me. They were trying to remove me. And sitting there inside Walter's office, staring at forged versions of my own name, I realized something terrifying. This plan had started long before I forgot my wallet that morning. I don't remember driving home from Walter's office. Later, I realized I must have stopped at least 3 red lights and crossed the river twice. But my mind replayed only one image over and over again. My forged signature. There's something deeply violating about seeing your own name used against you, especially when the people behind it once held your hand crossing parking lots as children. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the sky had already started darkening. October evenings in Wisconsin always arrive too early. The trees along the street swayed gently in the cold wind while porch lights flickered on one house at a time. Home. I used to feel safe seeing this place. Now I felt like I was parking outside someone else's plans for my life. Claire's Lexus sat in the driveway beside Ethan's SUV. Both home, both inside pretending everything was normal. I stayed in the car for another minute before finally turning off the engine. Then I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. My silver hair had come loose slightly from the wind. My lipstick had faded hours ago. There were new lines around my mouth I didn't remember seeing before. A tired, old woman. That's probably what Claire saw when she looked at me now. Someone slow, someone emotional, someone easy to pressure. The thought almost made me smile, because old age teaches you things younger people rarely understand. Patience, silence, timing. I carried myself inside calmly. The smell of garlic and soy sauce drifted from the kitchen. Thai food, just like Ethan mentioned earlier. Claire stood near the stove transferring noodles into serving bowls while soft jazz played from a speaker near the counter. Ethan sat at the island scrolling through emails on his phone. The picture of a peaceful family evening, carefully arranged. Claire looked up first. "There you are," she said brightly. "We were about to eat." I hung my coat slowly near the hallway closet. For a second, my eyes drifted toward the framed family photograph still hanging beside the stairs. It was taken 5 years earlier during our lake vacation in Door County. Daniel sat in the center wearing sunglasses while Ethan stood behind him with one hand resting on his shoulder. Claire leaned against Ethan, smiling perfectly toward the camera. Back then, I believed smiles meant something. Now I understood how often they hide things instead. "How was your afternoon?" Ethan asked casually. I looked directly at him, then at Claire. Neither one knew where I'd been. Neither one knew I had seen the forged paperwork. And suddenly, for the first time since all of this began, I realized something important. The advantage was no longer theirs. It was productive, I answered calmly. Claire's eyes flickered briefly toward Ethan. Tiny movement, almost invisible. But once trust disappears, you notice every glance. We sat down for dinner a few minutes later. 3 bowls, 3 glasses of water, 3 people pretending. Rain started again outside while the grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hallway. Claire talked the most. She always did whenever she felt nervous. "There's a new organic market opening near Brookfield," she said while serving rice noodles onto her plate. "Their prepared meals are supposed to be amazing for seniors." Seniors. Not people. Not me. Just seniors. I lifted my fork quietly. "That sounds convenient," I replied. Claire smiled too fast. "Oh, definitely. They also partner with retirement communities nearby. Some of those places are really beautiful now." There it was. Not subtle anymore. A test. I took a slow sip of water before answering. "I'm not planning on moving anywhere." Silence settled instantly over the table. Ethan lowered his eyes toward his plate. Claire recovered first. "Well, of course," she said lightly. I just meant eventually. It's important to think ahead. Eventually. Such a harmless little word. People hide cruelty inside words like that all the time. Daniel used to warn me about conversations that sounded too polished. When people rehearse concern, he once said, they usually want something. At the time, I thought he sounded cynical. Now I wished I had listened more carefully. Dinner continued awkwardly after that. Mostly small talk. Work. Traffic. The weather turning colder. But underneath every sentence sat something heavier now. Knowledge. Mine. Not theirs. At one point, Ethan finally looked up from his plate. You seem tired, Mom. I almost laughed again. Tired. As if exhaustion was the biggest thing happening inside me. I didn't sleep much, I answered truthfully. Claire reached for her wine glass carefully. Well, she said, stress isn't good at your age. I looked directly at her. Neither of us blinked. Then I smiled softly. You're absolutely right. For the first time all evening, Claire looked uncomfortable. Good. After dinner, Ethan carried plates toward the sink, while Claire disappeared upstairs to take a phone call. I heard her bedroom door close above us. The moment we were alone, Ethan finally spoke. Mom, his voice sounded different now. Not confident, not rehearsed, just tired. I remained seated at the table while he stood beside the sink staring down into soapy water. What is it? I asked quietly. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he dried his hands slowly on a kitchen towel before turning toward me. Have you ever thought about downsizing? He asked carefully. There it was, finally spoken aloud. Not by Claire, by my son. The little boy who once cried because I missed one of his middle school basketball games while taking care of Daniel's mother. After surgery, I remembered making him hot chocolate afterward while he sat wrapped in a blanket on the couch. You always come first, I told him that night. I meant it. God help me, I meant it. And now here he was asking me to surrender the last piece of my life Daniel built beside me. I folded my hands calmly in my lap. Why are you asking me that? Ethan hesitated, then sat down slowly across from me. For a moment, he looked older than 42. Older than Daniel ever looked. There are options out there, he said carefully. Communities with medical staff and transportation and social activities. Places designed to make things easier. Easier for who? I wanted to ask it, but I already knew the answer. Instead, I simply watched him. And slowly, painfully, I began realizing something even worse than Claire's manipulation. Ethan wasn't just being controlled anymore. He had started convincing himself this was kindness. That's the frightening thing about greed. If people sit beside it long enough, eventually they stop recognizing it altogether. Upstairs, I heard Claire's muffled laughter through the ceiling. Then Ethan said the sentence that finally made everything inside me go cold. We're only trying to do what's best for you, Mom. I looked at my son for a very long time. Then I nodded once. Quietly, calmly. And inside my cardigan pocket, my fingers tightened around the copies of the forged documents Walter had given me. That night, after Ethan went upstairs, I stayed alone at the kitchen table long after the food turned cold. The house had become very quiet again. Only the refrigerator humming softly in the corner. The grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Rain tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. I sat there staring down at Daniel's old coffee mug resting beside my plate. White ceramic. Small chip near the handle. He used it every morning for nearly 15 years because he claimed coffee tasted better from a real mug. Claire hated that mug. 2 months after moving in, she suggested throwing it away. It looks worn out, she said casually while unloading the dishwasher. I remember taking it gently from her hands before she could place it in the trash. No, I told her quietly. It stays. At the time, she smiled and apologized. But now I wondered how many times she had looked around this house calculating which parts of my life still needed removing. I finally stood up and carried the dishes to the sink. Upstairs, I could hear muffled movement from the master bedroom. Closet doors opening and closing. Claire's soft footsteps crossing the floor. Ethan speaking too quietly for me to understand. Their room now, not mine. Even after all these months, that truth still hurts sometimes. Daniel painted that bedroom himself the summer before Ethan left for college. We spent 3 weekends arguing playfully over paint colors while listening to baseball games on the radio. Every corner of that room once belonged to memories. Now strangers were making plans there. I dried my hands carefully and turned off the kitchen light before heading upstairs. Halfway down the hallway, I stopped. Voices again. Low. Tense. coming from behind the bedroom door. I wasn't trying to listen at first, but then Claire said my name, and suddenly my feet refused to move. "She's getting suspicious," Claire whispered sharply. Ethan sighed heavily. "You're overreacting." "No, I'm not," Claire snapped back. "She came home yesterday. She saw something, Ethan." A long silence followed. Then my son spoke again. "We just need more time." Time. That word again. I stood frozen in the dark hallway while my heartbeat thudded painfully against my ribs. Claire lowered her voice further, but I still caught pieces. "Loan deadline. Can't lose everything now. House has enough equity. Loan." Everything inside me tightened instantly. Walter never mentioned loans, only the forged paperwork, which meant there was more happening than even he knew. I slowly stepped backward away from the door before the floorboards could creak beneath me. Then I returned quietly to my room and closed the door without making a sound. For several minutes, I simply stood there staring at the darkness. Loan deadline. Enough equity. I repeated the phrases silently in my mind. Daniel spent 30 years building financial security for this family. He planned carefully, invested carefully, protected carefully, not because he loved money, because he understood fear. Daniel grew up poor in northern Michigan with 5 brothers sharing one bedroom. He once told me the worst feeling in the world was watching your parents panic over bills they couldn't pay. "I never want you to feel unsafe," he promised me years ago. And now our son was gambling away the very security Daniel sacrificed his life building. I sat down slowly on the edge of my bed. Then I opened the folder Walter gave me earlier that afternoon. Property transfer drafts, trust modification attempts, forged signatures. I looked through everything again more carefully this time. That's when I noticed another detail. A company name attached to several financial requests. Hawthorne Development Group. I frowned immediately. The name sounded familiar. Then suddenly I remembered. 3 years earlier, Ethan mentioned investing in a commercial real estate project with one of Claire's cousins near Madison. At the time, he sounded excited about passive income and long-term growth. Daniel hated the idea immediately. "I don't trust investments I can't explain in one sentence," he muttered afterward while we cleaned the kitchen. Ethan argued with him for nearly an hour that night. It was one of the last real arguments they ever had before the cancer became too aggressive. Back then, I assumed Daniel was simply being cautious. Now I wondered whether that investment had failed, and whether my home had become their solution. I barely slept again. Around 4 in the morning, I finally gave up trying and walked downstairs for tea. The house sat silent beneath the darkness. As the kettle warmed on the stove, I noticed light glowing faintly beneath Ethan's office door across the hallway. I hesitated, then slowly walked closer. The door wasn't fully shut. Inside, Ethan sat alone at his desk with both elbows resting against the surface, staring at something on his laptop screen. For a moment, he looked exhausted. Not manipulative, not cruel, just broken. That almost made it harder. Then I noticed the stack of overdue notices scattered beside his keyboard. Red lettering, final reminders, past due balances. One envelope partially faced toward the doorway, just enough for me to read the amount printed across the top. $148,000. My breath caught. I stepped back immediately before he could notice me. $148,000. No wonder Claire sounded desperate. No wonder they needed signatures quickly. I returned silently to the kitchen while the kettle whistled softly behind me. There's a moment when betrayal stops feeling personal and starts feeling transactional. That realization changes everything. By sunrise, I already understood the truth. This wasn't just greed anymore. It was panic, and panic people become dangerous, especially when they believe losing everything is worse than losing their conscience. Around 8 o'clock, Claire came downstairs dressed elegantly for another client meeting. Perfect makeup, perfect hair, perfect smile. She paused when she saw me sitting calmly at the kitchen table. "You're up early," she said carefully. I couldn't sleep. She poured herself coffee without meeting my eyes. For the first time since all of this started, I noticed something beneath her polished confidence. Fear. Small. Hidden. But there. Good. She glanced toward the hallway before speaking again. "Ethan has been under a lot of stress lately," she said softly. "I hope you know we're only trying to make responsible decisions for the future." Responsible. Such a clean word for ugly things. I looked directly at her over the rim of my coffee cup. Then I asked the question quietly. "How much money did you lose?" Claire froze completely. The coffee pot slipped slightly in her hand before she caught it again. For one long second, neither of us moved. And in that silence, I finally knew two things for certain. First, I was right. And second, Claire finally understood that I was no longer blind. Claire didn't answer my question immediately. She just stood there gripping the coffee pot too tightly while the kitchen filled with silence. "How much money did you lose?" I repeated it calmly. Not louder, not angry. That seemed to unsettle her more. People expect older women to cry when they're betrayed, or yell, or fall apart dramatically, enough to make everyone else feel powerful. But calmness changes the balance in a room. Claire slowly set the coffee pot down beside the sink. "I don't know what you mean," she said carefully. "A lie, not even a good one." I looked at her for another moment before taking a sip of coffee. Then I nodded once. "Of course," I said softly. And just like that, I let the conversation end. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Confusion. Claire expected confrontation. She wanted emotion she could manage. What she didn't know yet was that once trust dies, silence becomes incredibly useful. A few minutes later, Ethan came downstairs wearing a navy button-down shirt and carrying his laptop bag. He looked exhausted again, dark circles beneath his eyes, shoulders tense. He kissed Claire quickly on the cheek before pouring himself coffee. Normal. Practiced. Like the two of them had already agreed on how to behave around me now. "I may be late tonight," Ethan said while checking his phone. "The investors want another meeting." Investors? There it was again. I noticed Claire glance toward him sharply. Tiny movement. Fast, but enough. Ethan immediately looked down into his coffee cup afterward. Daniel used to say guilt always makes people avoid eye contact eventually. He was right about that too. After they left the house, I remained seated at the kitchen table listening to the silence settle around me again. Then I stood up slowly and walked toward Daniel's old office. Claire had redecorated most of the downstairs after moving in. New rugs, new curtains, new furniture that looked expensive but uncomfortable. But Daniel's office remained mostly untouched, probably because neither Ethan nor Claire spent much time in there anymore. The room still smelled faintly like old paper and cedar wood. Bookshelves lined the walls beside framed photographs from business trips and family vacations. Daniel's desk sat near the window exactly where he left it before the hospital stays became permanent. For a long moment, I simply stood there looking around. This room used to feel safe. Now it felt like evidence. I sat carefully in Daniel's leather chair and opened the bottom drawer of the desk. Inside rested years of organized paperwork, tax records, insurance policies, investment statements. Daniel labeled everything carefully because he believed confusion creates vulnerability. "Keep paperwork neat," he always told Ethan. "The moment you stop understanding your money, somebody else starts controlling it." I finally understood what he meant. About 20 minutes later, I found something interesting. A sealed envelope tucked beneath an old property appraisal folder. My name written across the front in Daniel's handwriting. Margaret. Nothing else. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside sat a single folded letter dated 6 months before Daniel died. I recognized immediately that it was written during the period when his illness worsened quickly. His handwriting had become less steady by then, but still readable. "Margaret, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer around to explain things myself. There are some financial protections I put in place that only Walter fully understands. Not because I don't trust Ethan, but because I'm afraid he confuses love with obligation. Please be careful about anyone pressuring you into quick decisions after I'm gone, especially regarding the house. People change when fear enters the room." I had to stop reading for a moment. My vision blurred suddenly. Daniel knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. Enough to leave warnings behind. I pressed the letter carefully against my chest while memories flooded back all at once. The late-night conversations between Daniel and Walter behind closed office doors during his final months. The trust paperwork. Daniel insisting I learn where account information was stored even when I told him not to worry about those things. At the time, I thought he was simply preparing for death. Now I realized he was preparing me for what came after. I wiped my eyes quickly and continued reading. The last paragraph hit hardest. "You've spent your whole life protecting everyone else. Promise me you'll protect yourself too when the time comes." I folded the letter carefully, then sat there in silence, staring out the office window while cold autumn sunlight spread across the backyard. Daniel built that backyard patio with his own hands when Ethan was 10 years old. Every summer we hosted barbecues there, neighbors laughing, grandchildren running through sprinklers, music drifting from cheap outdoor speakers while Daniel burned hamburgers pretending he knew how to grill professionally. Back then, family felt simple. Now every memory seemed wrapped in warning signs I missed. Around noon, Walter called. "I did some digging this morning," he said without greeting. Immediately, my stomach tightened. "What did you find?" A pause. Then his voice lowered. "Hawthorne Development Group filed emergency restructuring paperwork last week." I closed my eyes. How bad is it? Bad enough that investors are demanding repayment immediately. I gripped the edge of Daniel's desk. Walter continued carefully. "Ethan personally guaranteed several loans connected to the project." Loan guarantees. I didn't fully understand business law, but I understood enough to know what that meant. If the company collapsed, creditors could come after personal assets, including houses, including mine. "How much?" I whispered. Walter hesitated, then finally answered. "Close to $900,000. The room went completely still. $900,000. I thought about Ethan sitting exhausted inside his office, surrounded by overdue notices. About Claire whispering urgently upstairs in the dark. About forged signatures in retirement brochures and rushed property transfers. Panic, not greed alone. Desperation. And desperate people convince themselves terrible things are reasonable. Walter spoke again. "There's something else." I braced myself against the desk. "The property consultant Claire met with," he continued. "He specializes in fast asset liquidation before bankruptcy exposure." I stared silently at the wall across from me. Liquidation. Such a clean business word. Makes destruction sound organized. When were they planning to do this? I asked quietly. Walter exhaled slowly. "Soon." That single word settled heavily into the room. Soon. Soon they planned to move me out. Soon they planned to take Daniel's house. Soon they planned to erase 42 years of my life because they were drowning financially. And sitting there inside my husband's office, holding the letter he wrote before dying, I realized something with complete clarity. Ethan and Claire weren't just trying to save themselves anymore. They were willing to sacrifice me to do it. After my call with Walter, I stayed inside Daniel's office for a long time. The afternoon sunlight had started fading by then, turning the room soft and gray. Dust drifted slowly through the light near the bookshelves while the old radiator hissed quietly beneath the windows. I sat there holding Daniel's letter in both hands. People talk about betrayal like it arrives all at once. It doesn't. Most of the time, it arrives slowly enough that you explain it away piece by piece until suddenly there's nothing left to explain. I thought about Ethan as a little boy sitting on this very office floor building towers out of old legal pads while Daniel worked late into the evening. He used to run into my arms whenever thunderstorms scared him. When did fear turn into this? When did my son begin seeing me as collateral damage? The thought hurt more than I could admit, even to myself. Around 4 o'clock, I finally heard the front door open downstairs. Claire. A few seconds later, her heels clicked across the hardwood floor toward the kitchen. Then silence. She probably noticed Ethan's car wasn't home yet. I remained inside the office without moving. A minute later, soft footsteps approached down the hallway, then stopped outside the partially open door. Claire appeared in the doorway wearing a beige coat and carrying 2 shopping bags from an upscale department store downtown. For a brief second, surprise crossed her face. She wasn't expecting to find me there. "I didn't know you were in here," she said carefully. I folded Daniel's letter quietly and slipped it back inside the envelope before answering. "I used to spend a lot of time in this room." Claire forced a small smile. Of course, neither of us mentioned the tension hanging between us now, but it sat there anyway. Heavy, visible. Claire glanced briefly toward the desk, toward the paperwork beside me, then quickly away again. Fear. There it was again. Tiny. Cracks beginning to show beneath her polished exterior. She stepped further into the room slowly. "Ethan's been really stressed lately," she said softly. "I hope you know none of this is personal." None of this. Interesting choice of words. I looked at her calmly. "What exactly is this, Claire?" She froze. Only for a second, but long enough. Then she sighed quietly and set her shopping bags near the bookshelf. For the first time since all of this began, she looked tired. Not glamorous, not composed, just tired. "You don't understand how bad things got," she murmured. I said nothing. People reveal more when silence makes them uncomfortable. Claire crossed her arms tightly against herself. "The project collapsed in August," she admitted quietly. The investors pulled out after the zoning issues. Ethan thought we could recover, but then the banks started calling the loans. There it was, the truth finally beginning to crawl into the light. I listened without interrupting. Claire stared toward the office window while speaking. We used almost everything trying to keep the company alive, she continued. Retirement accounts, savings, credit lines. I thought about the overdue notices scattered across Ethan's desk, about the fear in his eyes during breakfast, about Daniel warning me that fear changes people. He was right again. Claire finally looked back at me. We weren't trying to hurt you. I almost pitied her then. Almost. Because people always say that after they've already decided your suffering is acceptable, then why forge my signature? I asked quietly. Her face lost color immediately. For several seconds, she simply stared at me. And in that moment, she understood something important. Walter told me everything. Claire sat down slowly in the chair across from Daniel's desk. The same chair Ethan used to sit in while asking his father for advice about college applications and first jobs and mortgages. Now his wife sat there discussing forged documents. Life changes so strangely sometimes. We were desperate, she whispered. Not apology. Explanation. There's a difference. I studied her carefully. Claire always carried herself like someone in control. Perfect posture, perfect words, perfect appearance. But desperation had finally begun stripping that away. Mascara slightly smudged beneath one eye, hands trembling faintly, voice thinner now. You could have talked to me, I said softly. Claire laughed once under her breath. Short, humorless, and said what? Hi, Margaret. We lost nearly $1 million, and now we need your house to survive. At least she was honest now. The room fell quiet again. Then Claire said something that settled heavily inside my chest. Ethan never wanted it to happen like this. I looked at her carefully. What exactly did he want? She hesitated too long. Finally, she answered. He thought maybe you'd volunteer eventually. Move somewhere smaller, somewhere easier. Volunteer. As if surrendering my home would have been some thoughtful family contribution. I stared down at Daniel's desk. The scratches near the edge where Ethan carved his initials accidentally at 14. The faded coffee ring marks. The old brass lamp Daniel refused to replace because it still worked fine. This wasn't property. It was my life. Claire's voice softened suddenly. You have to understand something, she said quietly. If the banks come after Ethan personally, we lose everything. We, not him. We. That one word explained more than she realized. Claire didn't love this house. She loved survival. And survival makes people dangerous when they're cornered. I stood slowly from the chair. Claire looked up immediately. For the first time since she entered the room, she seemed uncertain of what I might do next. But I didn't yell, didn't threaten, didn't cry. I simply walked toward the bookshelf near the door and adjusted one of Daniel's framed fishing photographs slightly crooked on the shelf. Then I looked back at her. Do you know what Daniel worried about most before he died? I asked quietly. Claire said nothing. He worried Ethan had started measuring success by money instead of character. Her expression tightened immediately. I continued calmly. He said money problems pass eventually, but the things people do while panicking stay with them forever. Silence filled the office again. Claire lowered her eyes toward the floor, and for one brief second, I think she finally understood that this story wasn't really about bankruptcy anymore. It was about the moment people decide who they're willing to become in order to save themselves. A car door slammed outside in the driveway. Ethan was home. Claire stood immediately, wiping quickly beneath her eyes before anyone could see. Then she looked at me one last time. Please don't destroy him over this, she whispered. I held her gaze steadily, then answered with the only truth I had left. I'm not the one who did this to him. That evening, the house felt different again. Not tense, not hostile, careful, like everyone inside suddenly understood the ground beneath them was no longer stable. After Claire left Daniel's office, I stayed there alone for several minutes listening to Ethan moving around downstairs. Cabinet doors opening, footsteps crossing the kitchen floor. The quiet rhythm of ordinary life continuing while something much darker sat underneath it. I folded Daniel's letter carefully and placed it inside my purse beside the copies Walter gave me. Then I turned off the office light and walked downstairs. Ethan stood near the stove stirring sauce absent-mindedly while staring at his phone screen. He looked up the moment he heard me enter. For a brief second, I saw fear in his eyes. Not because he knew exactly what Claire told me, because he knew something had changed. Children always know when their mothers stop being easy to deceive. "How was your day?" he asked casually. Such a normal question. I wondered if he realized how strange normality sounded now. "It was enlightening," I answered calmly. His hand paused slightly against the wooden spoon. Tiny movement, but enough. Claire entered the kitchen a moment later after washing her face upstairs. Her makeup looked freshly touched up. Her expression composed again. Polished. Controlled. But her eyes gave her away now. Once people reveal panic, they can never fully hide it again. Dinner that night felt strangely polite. Too polite. Claire complimented the salad I made. Ethan asked whether I needed help carrying laundry upstairs tomorrow. Every sentence sounded carefully selected, like two people trying desperately to restore a version of reality that had already collapsed. I played along. That surprised them most. I smiled when appropriate, answered calmly, even laughed softly once when Ethan mentioned how terrible Wisconsin drivers become during rainstorms. But inside, something had shifted permanently. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was observing. There's power in that. Around 8:30, Ethan's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and immediately stood from the table. "I need to take this," he muttered. Claire's shoulders tightened instantly. He disappeared into the hallway toward the back patio door. A few seconds later, Claire stood too quickly. "I should check something upstairs." She followed him. I remained alone at the dining table, staring down at untouched tea growing cold between my hands. Then, very faintly through the partially open patio door, I heard Ethan's voice outside. Sharp. Panicked. "You told me we had more time." Silence followed. Then again, "No, absolutely not. We can't force her." My chest tightened immediately. Force. I sat very still. Rain tapped softly against the windows while Ethan continued speaking outside in low, urgent bursts. Trying to handle it. "She's suspicious now. If they freeze the accounts, we're done." The accounts. Not account. Plural. This situation was spreading further than they admitted. A minute later, Claire stepped quietly back into the dining room and froze when she saw me still sitting there. For one brief second, neither of us spoke. Then she forced another small smile. "Tea getting cold?" she asked lightly. I looked directly at her. "Yes," I answered. "So are people." Her expression flickered slightly before she turned away toward the kitchen sink. Good. Let her wonder what I meant. That night, after they went upstairs, I made another call to Walter. He answered immediately. "I was expecting you," he said quietly. Of course he was. People like Walter spent entire careers learning how silence works. "I overheard something tonight," I told him. Then I repeated every piece of Ethan's phone conversation I could remember. Walter listened without interrupting. When I finished, he exhaled slowly. "That confirms it," he said. "Confirms what?" Another pause. Then his voice lowered carefully. "They're likely using your property as leverage against multiple outstanding obligations." I closed my eyes briefly. How bad is this really? Worse than Ethan probably admitted to Claire. My stomach tightened immediately. Walter continued. Hawthorne Development wasn't just one failed project. Ethan signed personal guarantees connected to at least 3 associated developments. 3, not 1. I sat slowly at the edge of my bed while gripping the phone tighter. "They've been trying to buy time," Walter explained. "Refinancing debt, moving money between accounts, delaying creditors, and my house." Silence. Then finally, the cleanest asset they have access to. Access. Such a cold word for family betrayal. I stared around my bedroom quietly. My small bedroom now. The room at the end of the hallway Claire called cozy after moving me out of the master suite. Daniel's old quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed. The small lamp beside my nightstand. The framed photograph of Ethan at age 8 missing his front teeth and holding up a fish he caught during our camping trip near Green Lake. I remembered how proud he looked that day. Daniel carried him on his shoulders back to the cabin afterward because Ethan refused to stop talking about the fish. That little boy still existed somewhere inside the man drowning himself in debt. That realization hurt worst of all. Walter's voice pulled me back. "There's something you need to understand, Margaret." I waited quietly. If creditors discover forged transfer attempts involving trust property, things could become criminal very quickly. Criminal. The words settled heavily into the room. I thought about Claire sitting across from me in Daniel's office, whispering that they were desperate. I thought about Ethan outside in the rain, insisting they couldn't force me. And suddenly I realized something important. Ethan still had a line he didn't want crossed. Claire didn't. "Walter," I asked quietly, "if I do nothing, what happens?" He answered immediately, "You lose the house." Simple, direct. No softness left. And Ethan? A longer silence this time. Probably everything else too. After the call ended, I remained sitting there in darkness for a long while. Somewhere upstairs, floorboards creaked softly beneath Ethan and Claire's footsteps. My family, or what remained of it. I thought about Daniel's final months again. The exhaustion in his face. The way he still squeezed my hand during hospital appointments, even when pain medication made him barely conscious. One night near the end, he whispered something while we watched snow falling outside his hospital window. "Promise me something," he said quietly. "Anything. Don't disappear after I'm gone." At the time, I thought he meant grief, loneliness, but now I understood differently. He knew how easily older women become invisible once people stop seeing them as useful. That wasn't going to happen to me. Not anymore. The next morning, I woke before dawn again. But this time, something inside me felt steady. Not broken. Steady. And for the first time since forgetting my wallet that afternoon, I stopped thinking like a victim and started thinking like Daniel would have. The next 3 days passed quietly. Too quietly. That's the strange thing about families hiding secrets. Once the truth surfaces, even partially, every normal moment begins feeling rehearsed. Breakfast conversations became shorter. Claire smiled more often than usual. Ethan avoided being home whenever possible. And I noticed both of them watching me carefully now. Not openly, but enough. Like people waiting to see whether a storm has fully passed or is still forming offshore. I let them wonder. Every morning, I made coffee before sunrise and sat alone at the kitchen table listening to the house wake up around me. The refrigerator humming, pipes creaking softly, rainwater dripping from the gutters outside. Simple sounds, steady sounds. They helped me think. Walter and I spoke twice more during those days. Quiet conversations, careful conversations. He advised me not to confront Ethan directly yet. Desperate people make reckless choices when cornered, he warned. I understood what he meant, especially after noticing new things around the house. One afternoon, I found Claire standing in the garage photographing furniture with her phone. When she saw me, she smiled immediately. "Oh," she said lightly. "My cousin asked about interior design ideas." I nodded politely. But later that evening, I noticed several of Daniel's old tools missing from the garage shelves. Small things disappearing now. Testing what I would notice. Testing what they could move. Another night, Ethan came home after midnight smelling faintly like whiskey and exhaustion. I heard him pacing downstairs for nearly an hour before finally sitting alone on the back patio despite the cold. At 2 in the morning, I looked through the kitchen window and saw him with his head in his hands. For a moment, he looked exactly like the little boy who cried after failing his driver's test at 16. I almost opened the door, almost walked outside and wrapped a blanket around his shoulders the way I used to. But then I remembered the forged signatures, the retirement brochures, the conversations about moving me out for my own good. Love without boundaries becomes permission, and I was finally learning the difference. Thursday evening, Claire announced dinner plans. "We thought it might be nice to eat together tonight," she said brightly while setting the table with unusual care. Thought, not wanted, planned. I noticed the difference immediately. Claire even used the good plates from the china cabinet, the ones reserved for holidays and anniversaries back when Daniel was alive. Candles flickered softly near the center of the table. Wine glasses, cloth napkins, a performance. Ethan barely touched his food all evening. His knee bounced nervously beneath the table while Claire carried most of the conversation herself. She spoke about community events, holiday decorations downtown, a charity gala one of her friends attended in Chicago. None of it mattered. The real conversation hadn't started yet. I simply waited. Eventually, Claire folded her napkin carefully beside her plate and smiled at me. "There's actually something we wanted to discuss with you." There it was. I set my fork down quietly. Ethan stared at the table. Claire reached toward a leather folder resting beside her chair. My chest remained perfectly calm, almost surprisingly calm, because by then, I already knew exactly what they were about to do. "We've been thinking a lot about the future," Claire began smoothly. "About what's best for everyone long term." Everyone. People always hide selfishness inside group language. She slid several papers across the table toward me. Property documents, transfer agreements, temporary power authorization forms, all neatly organized. prepared carefully. I looked down at the papers without touching them, then slowly raised my eyes toward Ethan. He still wouldn't look at me. Not once. Claire continued speaking. These documents would make things easier if there were ever medical emergencies or financial complications later on. Medical emergencies? At 67, they already spoke about me like decline was inevitable. I remained silent. Claire mistook silence for uncertainty. That was her mistake. The idea, she continued carefully, is simply to restructure ownership gradually now while everything is stable. Stable. Interesting word considering creditors were circling them like wolves. Finally, Ethan spoke quietly. It just protects the house, Mom. Protects. I almost admired how thoroughly they'd convinced themselves of their own lies. I picked up the top page slowly. The signature line waited at the bottom. Blank. Waiting for me. For one brief second, I imagined what would happen if Daniel could see this table now. His son, his daughter-in-law, candles glowing softly while they pressured his widow into surrendering the home he spent 4 decades building for us. The thought hurt, but strangely, it no longer broke me. It clarified me. I set the papers back down gently, then looked at Claire. You've worked very hard on this. Her expression flickered slightly, not the reaction she expected. These are just preliminary drafts, she replied carefully. Of course you can review everything first. Review, as if forged versions didn't already exist somewhere else. I turned toward Ethan again, still avoiding my eyes. Did you read all of these yourself? I asked quietly. His throat moved slightly before answering, yes. Lie, or maybe partial truth. Hard to tell anymore. Claire leaned forward softly. We know this is emotional, she said, but eventually these decisions become necessary for families. Necessary. Another clean word. I folded my hands calmly in my lap. Then I smiled. Not bitterly, not sadly, just calmly. You know, I said softly, Daniel always believed rushed paperwork was dangerous. The room went still. Claire's smile tightened slightly. Ethan finally looked up. Only briefly, but long enough. I continued gently. He used to say anyone pressuring signatures during stressful situations usually benefits from confusion. Silence spread heavily across the dining room. Rain tapped softly against the windows again. The grandfather clock chimed once in the hallway, and suddenly I realized something important. Neither of them knew how much I already understood. That uncertainty was terrifying them. Good. I slowly closed the folder and slid it back across the table. I'd like my attorney to review everything first, I said calmly. Claire froze immediately. Ethan's face lost color. Just slightly, but enough. Attorney? Claire repeated carefully. I nodded once. Yes, I answered softly. Walter Green. For the first time since this entire nightmare began, neither of them even tried to hide their fear. After I mentioned Walter's name, dinner ended quickly. Too quickly. Claire gathered plates with stiff, controlled movements while Ethan disappeared upstairs without finishing his wine. Neither of them argued with me. Neither tried pushing the paperwork further. That told me everything. People only fear attorneys when they already know they're wrong. I stayed at the table alone for a while after they left the room. The candles had almost burned down completely by then, wax pooling quietly onto the silver holders Daniel bought during our anniversary trip to Savannah years ago. Outside, rain continued falling steadily against the windows. Inside, the house no longer felt like home. It felt like waiting. The next morning, Walter called before 8. I arranged something, he said immediately. I stood near the kitchen sink holding my coffee mug while pale. Gray sunlight filtered through the curtains. What kind of something? A formal review meeting. My stomach tightened slightly. When? Tomorrow afternoon. Silence settled between us briefly. Then Walter added carefully, I think it's time everyone sits in the same room. By noon the following day, the entire house carried that strange nervous energy people try hiding behind routine. Claire cleaned constantly. Counters already spotless got wiped down again. She rearranged flowers near the dining room 3 separate times. Ethan barely spoke at all. Every time his phone buzzed, his face tightened before he quickly silenced it. Pressure, closing in from every direction now. At one point, I found him standing alone in the garage staring at nothing beside Daniel's old workbench. For a second, he looked so exhausted that my chest physically hurt. Then he noticed me watching. Immediately, the wall went back up again. You ready for this meeting? He asked quietly. I studied him carefully. No, I answered honestly. Neither of us spoke after that. By 3 o'clock, we arrived at Walter's office downtown. The same old brick building, the same creaky wooden floors. But this time, the atmosphere felt completely different. Heavier. Final somehow. Walter greeted us professionally near the conference room entrance. Not warmly, not coldly, just professionally. That unsettled Claire immediately. I could see it in the way she tightened her grip around her designer handbag. Inside the conference room sat another man I didn't recognize. Mid-50s. Dark suit. Sharp eyes. Several folders stacked neatly in front of him. Walter introduced him calmly. Margaret, this is Richard Sloan. He specializes in estate fraud and financial liability cases. Fraud. Claire's face lost color instantly. Ethan looked like he might be sick. Nobody sat down immediately. The silence stretched painfully across the room until Walter finally gestured toward the chairs. We should begin. I sat calmly beside Walter. Across from us, Ethan and Claire looked less like confident adults now and more like frightened people waiting for impact. Richard Sloan opened one of the folders slowly. Inside were copies of everything. The forged signatures, property transfer drafts, loan documents, financial exposure reports connected to Hawthorne Development. Claire's breathing visibly changed the moment she saw the papers. Fast now, uneven. Walter folded his hands carefully on the conference table. Before we continue, he said quietly, I'd like to give both of you the opportunity to explain yourselves honestly. Nobody answered. Finally, Ethan spoke first. We were trying to buy time. His voice sounded thin, tired. Walter nodded once. At what point did buying time become forging your mother's signature? Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Claire answered instead. We never filed the documents. Not denial. Technical defense. Richard Sloan finally spoke for the first time. You attempted fraudulent transfer activity involving protected trust assets, he said calmly. Legally, intent matters. The word legally seemed to hit Ethan like physical pain. He leaned forward suddenly. We weren't trying to hurt her. Richard's expression never changed. But you were willing to. Silence again. Heavy silence. The kind that forces people to hear themselves clearly for the first time. I looked at Ethan quietly across the table. My son. The little boy who once slept beside our Labrador during thunderstorms because he thought the dog got lonely. The teenager who cried when Daniel missed his first baseball game during a business trip. The grown man, now sitting across from lawyers discussing forged documents involving his widowed mother. Life can become unrecognizable, so slowly you barely notice until suddenly you do. Walter slid another document across the table toward Ethan. A copy of Daniel's trust. This, Walter said carefully, contains provisions your father added 6 months before his death. Ethan frowned slightly. What provisions? Walter looked directly at him. In the event coercion, fraud, or financial manipulation involving Margaret was ever discovered, control of all protected assets transfers immediately to an independent trustee. Claire stopped breathing for a second. Ethan stared blankly. Walter continued calmly. Neither of you have legal authority over the property anymore. The room went completely silent. Then Claire whispered, What? Richard Sloan folded his hands. Yesterday morning, he explained calmly, Margaret officially activated the protection clause. I said nothing. Didn't need to. The shock on their faces said enough. Ethan turned toward me slowly. You did this already? His voice sounded wounded, almost betrayed. That nearly broke something inside me. Almost. I met his eyes steadily. No, I answered softly. You did. Claire stood abruptly from her chair. This is insane, she snapped. We were trying to save our family. Walter's expression hardened for the first time. By sacrificing Margaret's security? Claire looked away immediately. Good. Richard Sloan opened another folder. There's one more issue, he said calmly. My stomach tightened slightly. The creditors connected to Hawthorne Development were informed this morning that the property transfer attempts involved unauthorized documentation. Ethan's face went pale instantly. What does that mean? It means, Richard replied evenly, they can no longer pursue Margaret's home as a recoverable asset. Claire slowly sat back down. Defeated now. No performance left. No polish. Just fear. Real fear. Ethan stared down at the conference table for a very long time. Then finally, quietly, he spoke. I never wanted it to go this far. Walter looked at him sadly. That's the problem with panic, he said softly. It rarely stops where people intended. Nobody spoke after that. Outside the conference room windows, cold rain slid slowly down the glass, while downtown traffic moved far below us. Life continuing, cars moving, people rushing home. And inside that room, my family finally collapsed under the weight of choices they spent months pretending were temporary. Then Ethan looked at me again, and for the first time since Daniel died, I saw shame fully reach his eyes. After the meeting ended, nobody spoke much. Walter walked me downstairs personally, while Ethan and Claire remained upstairs inside the conference room with Richard Sloan. I didn't ask what they discussed afterward. Some conversations belonged to consequences. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Cold sunlight broke weakly through the clouds above downtown Milwaukee, reflecting softly against the river beside the street. Cars moved through wet intersections while people hurried along sidewalks carrying coffee cups and umbrellas like any other ordinary afternoon. It felt strange how normal the world looked after your life changes completely. Walter stopped beside my car. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he handed me Daniel's original trust documents inside a leather folder. "Your husband loved you very much," he said quietly. I looked down at the folder in my hands. "I know." Walter nodded slowly. He knew this family better than anyone. That stayed with me during the drive home. Not the legal documents. Not the money. That sentence. He knew this family better than anyone. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same as always. White siding, blue shutters, maple leaves scattered across the lawn. The porch light Claire insisted on replacing last spring because the old one looked dated. Everything unchanged, and yet nothing inside it belonged to the same life anymore. I went inside quietly. The house was empty. Ethan and Claire hadn't returned yet. For the first time in months, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt honest. I walked slowly from room to room that evening. The kitchen, the living room, Daniel's office. Every corner carried memories. Some painful now, some comforting. I paused beside the hallway closet where Ethan used to hide Christmas presents when he was little because he thought I never noticed. I always noticed. Mothers usually do. Upstairs, I entered the master bedroom for the first time since giving it to Ethan and Claire after they moved in. Their clothes still hung inside the closet. Claire's perfume still lingered faintly in the air. But standing there now, I realized something important. This room never stopped being mine. I had simply allowed myself to shrink inside my own life because grief made me tired. That ends quietly sometimes. Not with screaming, not with revenge, just with clarity. The next morning, Ethan came home alone. I heard his car pull into the driveway around 9. Then, footsteps entering slowly through the front door. For several seconds, he remained standing in the hallway without speaking. I stayed seated at the kitchen table holding my coffee mug between both hands. Finally, he walked in. He looked terrible. No sleep. Red eyes. Same clothes from yesterday. My son suddenly looked much older than 42. He sat down across from me carefully, just like he used to after getting into trouble as a boy. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then finally, quietly, he said, "Claire left." I absorbed the sentence silently. Not surprised. Not satisfied either. Just tired. She went to stay with her sister in Illinois, he continued. The lawyers told us bankruptcy proceedings will probably start within the month. I nodded once. Outside, wind moved softly through the maple trees. A few leaves drifted across the backyard patio Daniel built all those years ago. "I'm sorry," Ethan whispered suddenly. There it was. Not an excuse. Not a justification. Just grief finally catching up to him. I looked at him carefully for a long moment. Then I asked the question that mattered most. "What exactly are you sorry for?" His face tightened immediately. "The lies," he admitted quietly. "The pressure, letting it get this far. Not the money, not losing the house. The lies." Good. That mattered. Tears filled his eyes suddenly, and for one heartbreaking second, I saw my little boy again beneath all the damage adulthood had layered over him. "I thought I could fix everything before you found out," he whispered. That sentence nearly destroyed me, because I believed him. Not the choices, but the fear behind them. Daniel used to say people don't become dangerous because they're evil. Most become dangerous because they're terrified. Still, terror doesn't erase consequences. I reached across the table slowly and placed my hand over Ethan's trembling fingers. "You should have trusted me with the truth," I said softly. He lowered his head immediately. "I know." And for a long time, we just sat there quietly while sunlight slowly filled the kitchen. No dramatic reconciliation. No miracle. Some wounds don't close that neatly. A week later, Ethan moved into a small apartment near downtown while legal teams untangled the financial collapse left behind by Hawthorne Development. The house remained protected exactly as Daniel intended. Walter arranged everything carefully. Independent trustees, locked asset protections, permanent restrictions against unauthorized transfers. Daniel planned for fear long before any of us realized why. I stayed in the house alone again after that. But strangely, it no longer felt empty the way it once did after Daniel died. Because loneliness and betrayal are different things. Loneliness aches. Betrayal erases. And surviving betrayal teaches you how to return to yourself afterward. A month later, I finally unpacked the box of autumn decorations still sitting untouched in the garage. Pumpkins on the porch, candles near the windows, Daniel's old flannel blanket folded beside the couch. Small things, steady things, the kind that rebuild a life quietly. One Sunday morning, I made coffee and carried it onto the back patio just as sunlight rose across the yard. The air smelled like wet leaves and pine. Somewhere nearby, church bells rang softly through the neighborhood. I closed my eyes for a moment and listened. Peace doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it returns slowly after people who drained it finally leave. My phone buzzed softly beside my coffee cup. A text from Ethan. Simple. 3 words. I'm getting help. I stared at the message for a long moment. Then I placed the phone face down beside me and looked out across the backyard Daniel loved so much. I didn't hate my son. That surprised me most. Pain fades differently once truth finally stands in the open. But forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. Some doors reopen. Others remain closed quietly forever. And sitting there beneath the cold Wisconsin sunlight, wrapped in Daniel's old flannel blanket, while autumn leaves drifted across the yard we built together, I finally understood what my husband had tried to teach me all along. Love should never require disappearing inside your own life. Sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do is stop surrendering pieces of herself just to keep everyone else comfortable. I almost lost my home because I confused silence with peace. I won't make that mistake again.